All right, cool. So I'm Colin. I'm from LinkedIn, and we've been doing Robolectric for our unit tests for a little while now. And I wanted to talk about Robolectric because I find unit testing fairly important, and I'm not a big fan of what Google has basically done giving us tools for unit testing. They kind of require a device and stuff. Um, so I want to talk a little bit about what Robolectric is and what purpose it solves. I'm going to try to make the presentation portion short-ish so we can get onto coding, but it is important to know. So it's basically a JUnit test runner. It's going to do some neat things with the class loader. One of the neat or annoying things, I guess, about Android is the SDK. When you download the SDK and you're linking against it and you're compiling your code against it, the actual code is really just a set of stubs. There's no real implementation behind any of it. In fact, if you were to just make a Java program, import the android.jar and call any method, it's all going to throw a runtime exception with a stub. And that makes it really difficult to do any sort of testing just straight in Java. Since the actual implementation of the Android jar is only on an emulator or a device, you would need to do it in one of those. I don't necessarily like using emulators or devices. There's some restrictions to that. You're kind of stuck into whatever it is that you're in, and it usually is slower. You have to bring up an emulator. You actually have to run your test. Often ends up closing an emulator and that sort of thing. So Robolectric kind of solves a bunch of problems. It solves things like one, it's headless. That's kind of cool. So you don't need a UI for it at all. You're not having an emulator. You're not having a device. I can run this on a Hudson box that has no UI, no graphical capability at all, and it'll actually run all of our tests fine. That's useful for us. I mean, we have Hudson boxes, pretty common. The other thing is it has access to the Android internals. So anytime you are accessing any of the Android classes, it uses its class loader to insert its own copies of them. They're called shadows for Robolectric, and a lot of them actually just implement the same functionality that the Android source was. Android's open source, so they basically just re-implemented a lot of it. But it also gives you some access to certain things that you wouldn't normally see. I'll try to show off some of that in the live coding, but it'll let you see some of the variables that Android itself knows about, but since they're not really necessary for the developer to know about, they don't make public. But for testing purposes, they're really useful to know about because you want to verify that something actually happened, right? So you have access to that, which is cool. It's faster. It's faster because you don't have to launch an emulator and everything. Plus, another thing I've noticed that it can be faster with is if, like the test app that is up that you may have looked at actually does different configurations based on if it's a tablet or if it's a phone, right? Because that's a pretty common thing now. You can actually have, if you're doing your regular unit testing with emulators, you'd actually have to run two sets of tests, one with an emulator that's a tablet and one that's an emulator that's a phone, because your code might do different things in those different environments. Well, with Robolectric, we can just set a config and say, oh, for this specific test, pretend that we're a tablet, and load in my resource files as if I was a tablet, and that sort of thing. And it'll all just run in the same suite, which is really nice. And that's part of the config. So the config can let you change some sort of things on runtime, and I'll go over a little bit of that. The last one that I find really useful is your ability to mock server responses inside of your test really easily. It will, whenever you make a network request, by default, it actually intercepts all of them. You can let them through, but I find it really useful to have it intercept these things, mainly because if I'm going to make a network request, I don't want a real server to answer in my tests, because I want my tests to be deterministic. I want them to run the same way every time. And I might want the server to return an error, which hopefully if I wrote the server correctly shouldn't normally be throwing errors. But I do want to make it so that if it did, I would know what would happen in those sort of cases, and I can deterministically have the server return errors or any data that I might want, which I find pretty useful. So Robolectric, really useful. We use it for automation or for unit testing, really important. I think everyone should use some sort of framework for unit testing, if not Robolectric. But Robolectric isn't going to do everything for you. You're not going to get UI tests. You're not going to get your full integration tests with it. Just using Robolectric isn't really enough. You should still be doing UI tests. You should be still doing full-on integration tests along with it. And we do that at LinkedIn as well. So at LinkedIn, we have three different main types of tests that we generally run for Android. We have our Robolectric unit tests, which the devs write. The unit tests are fairly required. Anytime we submit any code for Android, it has to go through a code review process. Part of the code review process involves making sure that there are tests. If someone gives me an RB and it doesn't have tests and they made a non-layout change, I am going to not let them have it go through, and they won't be able to commit their code because we need to have tests for this stuff. The only thing that I generally don't is like if someone wants to change the point of a font or something or some minor UI things, they're not really unit testable anyway, and it's kind of pointless. That's meant for a UI test. That's not meant for a unit test, so that's kind of silly. We also do UI layout tests. So when I say UI layout test, what we're really doing is we will have templates or some sort of like setup of a layout, right? But the layouts can often have or be missing a bunch of different data. Like if I had a layout that had 3 different text fields, any of them could be null. I need to see that when something is null or something is missing, or if something's really long, like if I have a really long text or something that's going to wrap, that it still looks correct. And so we have tests that will verify and run, and those run in an emulator. We also have UI regression automation tests. These are larger tests that rather than testing specific UI components, they're actually testing system interactions. They're actually running the full app. They're running it against prod. They're using test accounts, and they're actually doing full-on actions and making sure that things don't fail. Those are written by both QA and dev. And we use a framework called Appium for doing that amongst our different platforms. So that's basically all that. Awesome. So I made a post of this project. It's a silly little project. Also, this is a to-do list. It was just to give something for us to kind of look at. So you can download it. There's build files for both Maven and Gradle. I use Maven because Maven was kind of the default that Robolectric has. They're starting to support more things, but there is a Gradle build, and it will work. You can actually run your test in Gradle. Small amount of modification. You can even get it running in the IDE. I did get that to work. And all this thing is a to-do list app. So we have a single basic test here that you can already run. I'm going to remove the failing line. Should be fine. Just make sure my whole environment actually is set up. Cool. So we have tests, and they run, and that's great. So one thing is I've already got a bunch of stuff running for in here, so I want to test some of the main stuff. The other things I'm going to do is I'm going to make a service, and I'll make a service right now, and we'll test how the service would work and then how the interactions with the service could work. But to start with, let me see. So I've got this. Actually, before this, cool thing to show off is this thing is using a pattern for doing different layouts depending on the screen size, right? So if it's a tablet, it'll look one way. It'll have 2 fragments. If it's a phone, it'll look another way. So I can test that actually pretty easily. The main thing that I want to know is what containers are going to exist. Great, so we can do that. That's pretty easy. Let's make a test here. So I want to, with this, let me make this not be the context. I'll make this the actual main activity. So this setup, what it's actually doing is, since we don't have the structures of an emulator, this is actually going to build an activity, right? And it's going to call all the create, the start, the resume, and all of those methods on it, and return it back to you. So it's going to go through all the life cycle things, which is pretty useful. So this will give us an activity. It also gives us a context because it's an activity. We can access resources and all that, and that's great. But anyway, I've got this main activity, and I want to make sure that if I'm on a tablet, that it's going to actually display the correct fragment. So I'll do that with actually, I think I might need to find it with layout. I think we're doing it with views, yeah. All right, cool. Let's run this. Cool, so this failed, and it's going to fail because by default, Robolectric is going to actually use the phone layout. By default, it assumes you're on a phone, right? So I need to actually tell this thing that I'm using a large screen device. So I can do that pretty easily. All right, so now it's going to use layout large. That is unrelated to this. That's probably just because I'm accidentally making database calls on the UI thread, which I shouldn't be doing. And I have to-do list tasks for that, but I ran out of time. Okay, so anyway, the test did pass. I'll do another quick one just to make sure that when we are on a phone that we do get the correct container. Cool. All right, cool. So that at least tells me my basic on create is working. I've got the correct containers are being inflated, so that's cool. Another thing I want to try is this list unsolicited. So this method is for if you have looked at so the to-do list is basically there's a list of possible to-do lists, so you can have multiples. You click on a to-do list, and it's going to bring up the list of items in that to-do list. It's going to bring up that to-do list basically, right? Or that task list. So when you click on it, it ends up calling this method. And this is supposed to tell it to, if we're on a tablet, to just tell that second fragment, hey, update your data with what it is. But if you're on a phone, that second fragment doesn't exist. So it says, oh, could you just launch a new fragment and launch it with this list ID? Right? So I need to have probably 2 tests for doing that. So I'll start with let's see. So the way that we're doing this is we look to see what the fragment container is. In this case, it shouldn't have one, so we're really just looking to make sure that a fragment is getting added. So this should be pretty easy. This should really just be us doing activity dot on list selected. We give it a number, like 1 or whatever. And now we should be able to say that cool, I've got an error. So it is in fact null. The fragment doesn't exist, so there's probably a bug somewhere in my code. Okay, so it looks like when on create, when I'm doing it on a phone, I'm adding the fragment to a transaction and I'm passing it in a tag, right? So this is what I'm trying to pull out. And I'm doing it here when I'm doing it on a tablet as well. When I'm doing a fragment switch though, I am not adding a tag to be able to identify the fragment later. So let me just add that. Cool. Yay, it worked. That's good. Okay, so this is kind of some of the stuff you can do for like just testing your activities and whatnot. I want to make something new though. We're going to make a service. So service calls. When I think of unit testing, I'm thinking of like I want to have tests for that specific thing, but I don't really. I want to know that calls have been made to external dependencies, but I don't really want to test the external dependency because it could change, and I don't really care about its implementation, right? So there's a couple things. I want to make a service, and then while I'm making the service, I want to make sure that the service works. That'd be good. And then afterwards, I want to make sure that if I call the service, like if I have something that's supposed to call the service, that the intent to start the service actually happened. I don't need the service to have I don't have to verify that the service went through and did all its stuff because the service has its own will have its own test for that. But I want to make sure that that'll work. So I'm going to make a service. Sure. Okay, so we use metrics a lot at LinkedIn. I mean, we pretty much track a lot of things that we know usage patterns. So I'll make a really bad metrics service because I'm coding it right now. So another thing I had to call. I forgot what it was. I have a cheat sheet. Oh, that's pretty much it. Oh, I have to actually create the stupid thing. That's what it is. This will totally get a null pointer exception. Cool. So let's see. Because I don't really want to write an entire metrics service, that would be huge. I'm just going to have it so that when you do an action, it'll store into shared preferences like using a key of whatever the action is and then increment a number, right? Because then we'll have at least in the share preferences. You could change this obviously to probably send a network request or something like that. But by default, we'll just have it set something. So let's make sure that that would work if we were to have implemented it, which we haven't. That's fine. This is the whole test-driven development. I'm going to actually write the test first, and then we'll actually make the implementation to see if it actually works. So we'll have it when you tap a list. Fine. Okay, so I'm just giving it Robolectric's application context to have a context. I'm going to use a tag here. So this will be our action for now. Put extra. All right, so I'm going to want to verify that the before we do anything that the shared preferences is empty as it's going to be. So let's do okay. So it shouldn't already exist, so it should just return 0 because that would be the default value. I'll make a service call. Cool. This should fail because we don't have an implementation yet. Oh, it passed. Why did it pass? Oh, it's because I had a default of... No, wait, why did it pass? Oh, right, I'm testing the wrong test. Thank you. I ran the other test. Let's run this one instead. There we go. That's wrong. Okay, good. Thank you. Cool. All right, so let's make sure that all of this is going to work. I'm doing this for brevity. I really don't like nested code like this because it often causes null pointer exceptions. But you get the idea. Cool, works. Okay, so that's making it so that we can test that the metric would actually get implemented if it got called. Now let's make sure that if we actually clicked on a list item, that the call gets made. So the way that we're going to do this is like I was saying before, the shadow classes that Robolectric provides gives us some of the information that you normally don't get access to as part of Android. This could start a service, but since it's an intent service, that's not overly useful to see it start instead of a unit test, because it's just going to run another thread. And I don't want to deal with the synchronization and all of that to actually see if it did what it was supposed to do. But and also to see what it's supposed to do, I have a metric intent service test that'll test to make sure that that it should work. What I need to do actually is verify that the service actually got started, that the start call happened, which since we haven't implemented it yet, it actually hasn't. So the way I can do that is with this. I don't remember which one it is. Oh, this is the only one I didn't really write down first. Does anybody remember on an intent what stores the class that you started the intent with? I can look it up, but I was hoping anybody knows. What was that?
I think it's like only if you start activity for result.
No, it's well. This isn't an activity, right? This is a service, right? But this is on the intent. The intent itself. If you start an intent based on, if you start an intent with a class, so like the example would be like this, right? If you do a new intent and you pass it in this class, might even tell me here. No, because this is just throwing the stubs exceptions. All right, I might have to look this up. I didn't look at this one first. I know I'll know when I see it. Get component, that's what it's called, get component. Right, so that should say that the service that I started, the class name of the service that I started, should equal this class name of this intent that was. Right, and that's because there was no next started service. I probably actually just put in there's no service got started. Cool. So let's actually make this happen. So I have a thing right here that's all it's doing is storing the last list ID so we can bring it up from there. But let's also actually send a metric. So we'll say let me make an intent for this. Oops. Cool, although that's obviously wrong because you'd have to send data to it. So we can just say that. Actually, I'll just do Alright, so my code is still broken, obviously. My test has proven that. Let's fix it. Honestly, I would probably make this so that you would get the intent back from the metric service. That's usually the safer way to do it. You'd have like a helper method on a static method on the metric service to say, hey, return me the list tap intent, and then pass it along, instead of having the activity need to know directly about that. So this isn't the best practice, but it should work. Cool. So I can call metrics, which are, according to my PM, the most important part of our application. The next one I want to do is some of that. I'll go back to the metrics service because that's a good enough place to do it. The network calls, right? So I want to be able to have a network call that's going to that we'll have it so that the metric will, oddly enough, call a web server to get the string that it's going to use to store. Not really overly useful, but gives you an example of what a network call override would look like. Okay, so let's make a new one here. But actually, I'll have it so that it'll return, the server itself will return the number that we're going to increment it by. That sounds fine. So what I'll do that is, so I'm going to say that when we connect to, we'll just say, for example, it will return 5. Right? So now we should be able to say that oh, still let me get the shared preferences. Basically, just copy this one. All right, I'm not going to run it. You all know that it's going to fail. So let's modify this a little bit. So we're going to say that we're going to have a special case that I'll do. That was just. Oh, did I import? I might have imported the wrong one. Yes. status code. Status line. Hold on, I forgot this one. I wrote it down there. Status. We'll have it default to 1 if the server doesn't respond or responds badly, something like that. So I think that's about correct. I don't know. We're going to find out. That's new. It's not even the right test. Okay, there we go. I don't know what the other one was. I think my development environment's kind of slightly screwed up because I have a different one at work, and I was trying to like jury rig it really quick to get it to work here. It works this time. Okay, so that's an example of how you could do a network request with Robolectric. So I've covered, doing activities, doing fragment switches, network requests. The whole thing is headless. That's great. Anybody have any questions? I could write a third test, but I don't know what you'd want. Those are like the quick ones that I was like, oh, these are some interesting ones that I find are really useful that I can't always do easily on Android. Okay, so boom. This is me. Anybody have any questions?
So you say that this is your standard way of doing your non-UI tests?
Yeah, for anything that's not UI, we generally use Robolectric. And you can test almost anything. The main thing that I have a problem with currently that I've tried so many ways of trying to figure out a solution is testing static methods. It's really hard if you have a class or a method that is accessing a static method that you don't want to actually call the static method. You want to use like a stub or a proxy. There's not a good way of mocking that. And the reason why is normally for something like that you'd use like PowerMock, right? PowerMock has a nice way of overriding static methods. PowerMock uses the class loader to kind of override what the static method is called, but Robolectric also overrides the class loader. So they conflict, and I haven't decided to go through the Robolectric code and manually add PowerMock into it because I don't really feel like playing around with class loaders. It'd be useful. I'll give a cookie to whoever wants to do it, but yeah, I don't. That's the main thing that I have problems with testing. And so if I have something that I really need to test that has static methods and I really don't want to call them, I'll usually use a singleton and wrap it, or I'll use a singleton wrapper, and then it's fine. You could just mock out the singleton. You have a question?
I had some. I was wondering if you had any advice for people who are living in Gradle land.
Yeah, so we actually do all of our stuff in Gradle. So this project had an example Gradle file. There's a couple cool things that you have to, well, annoying things you have to worry about with Gradle. So Google hasn't really released Gradle yet as like a full-on release, right? It's still in beta. They're still adding features, and it's getting better, which is nice. So if you can use it, there is a Gradle plugin that Robolectric has. It actually is up to date with the same version as the Gradle plugin for because I'm using the latest Android plugin 10, and the latest Android test plugin is the same thing, so it works fine. This will actually give you IDE integration. It'll import the entire thing. The only thing I noted, so here, I'll actually just do it to show you. So go to my project, and I'm going to remove the IML file and the idea directory, so we're going to have to import it, to start. So we're going to import it from Gradle. I'll use a new wrapper just for fun. So it'll import fine, and like your source directory, your test source directory will look fine. The tests won't run by default, but there is a way to get it to run, I found. There's two main problems that I ran into. So I'll go into my test and try to run it. All right, so the first problem is kind of the problem that Robolectric's trying to solve, and that's this stub exception. But you can get around this by doing a one-time kind of change. If you go into modules and dependencies, Gradle doesn't really work in Eclipse. If you're asking about Eclipse, I cannot help you. They don't have support for it. But if you're using IntelliJ or Android Studio, and actually I would just say IntelliJ because Android Studio, they removed a bunch of functionality for some reason. You can just move the Android APK, because that's what's loading in that default jar. Move it to the bottom. It's the easiest way to do this. And what it's really looking for is it's looking for JUnit, and it's saying, oh, there exists a version of JUnit in the Android API. I'll use that. But every method in the Android API throws runtime exception. Not awesome. So now that it's below JUnit, it should actually run, except it'll actually probably get a different error, but that's fine. Yeah, so then you get this one. It can't find the class. And the reason why it can't find the class is because for some odd reason, it never set the test output directory. So it has no idea where your test classes are. It builds it, and that's fine, but it doesn't actually know where your test sources are. So we'll just go to the build directory. We'll go into test classes. That's where my test classes are. I tell it there at once. I try to get this to work. It's supposed to, and maybe it would. There's an IDEA plugin that I was trying to set the test output directory, but I don't think this gets read when you do an import. I think it only works when you do Gradle, like the IDEA generation. I don't know if the IDEA generation works with Gradle and Android, so I haven't even tried it. You could try it, but basically this is what I'm trying to do. Yeah. So for dependencies, it's just importing. It's using Android test compile. Oh, so this is another thing. Currently, Google has decided that you only ever want one test project for your project, which is unreasonable. Hopefully, they're going to add support for having multiple test projects or having it so that you can set it. So right now, what it's doing is it's overriding the Android test project, right? And it's going to use that in place. That gives us IDE integration. That also means, though, if you wanted to use UI Automator and do your Android tests using this, you won't be able to. So the way that we do it, actually, is we don't override Android test compile. We actually don't even use the Android test plugin. We make our own task. We just call it unit test. and then we do manually like adding in the test paths and that sort of thing, and then we do it on the command line. So if you want to run your tests on the command line, you can run a Gradle unit test, and then it'll run all your unit tests. And then we have additional options where you can say Gradle unit test, and then pass in a parameter, say I only want to run this test, and it'll run, but it won't run in the IDE. It'll run on the command line, and then your output will be like in an HTML file. It's actually not that big of a deal. The whole thing runs on Hudson fine, but unfortunately, because we also have UI tests and we wanted to utilize this, it's actually for our layout tests. We can't get the IDE support. I might ask them to change that, honestly, because I'm pretty sure there's other ways we could set up those other tests, and IDE support would be awesome. So, but this is all you'd have to do. So you can access this. I made a post on the meetup that has links to this whole code. So you can use this as an example for trying to get it into your project to kind of get you started. Hopefully it'll help. But yeah, so this actually should run now, I think. It's really nice to be able to do it in the IDE because you can just get that fast. Yeah, there it goes. It actually runs. Right. So you can do it with Gradle. Gradle will work. Small kind of concessions you have to make for Google not doing things right, in my opinion, but whatever. Anything else?
You mentioned Mockito as well.
Yes. Well, this is using Mockito. I mean, you can use any mocking framework if you wanted to use mocking, right? You could use EasyMock as well. I just find Mockito is pretty useful, pretty easy to do it. I had a test. I didn't write it, but I could. I guess I could. So for like in this activity one, there's right. So I did this phone select. If I were to do tablet select, right? I would do it a little bit differently, and that's because the tablet select, it actually uses a fragment that gets returned because it's expecting a fragment to already get returned. So the short version of what I do is we actually spy on the activity and then have it return a mock fragment manager, and have the fragment manager return a mock task fragment. And now I can verify that the task, because again, I don't want to keep them coupled. I want to make it so that I don't necessarily have to call update list ID. I just need to know that it got called, right? So then I can just do a verification that the fragment that came out of there, its update list ID actually got called. That's all the test would have been. I could write it, but. So yeah, this is what we are currently using at LinkedIn for our unit tests, and it works pretty well, I think. We've got like over 800 tests, and we've only been using it for like 7 months. So.
What have you changed the Android SDK and the dependencies? You changed the Android like
yeah. So
order?
for Gradle support,
yeah.
So the basic problem is IntelliJ by default will, in its dependency, it has the API at the top. So that's just basically, it's going to look there first for any classes. And since we're using JUnit, and JUnit is included into the library, all you need to do is just move it down. You basically click on it and then hit the down arrow a bunch of times. It's a single manual step because support's just not fully there yet with Gradle integration. But a couple of manual steps isn't that bad. It used to not work at all, so this is actually a really big increase. Just a couple changes.
How long have you been using it?
We've been using Robolectric probably since it's like October, September, something like that. Yeah. Before that, there was some unit tests using Android's framework, but it was really flaky, and we weren't really onto it. And basically, what happened was I joined the team, and I was like, "No, we're going to do this," and pushed it in. So I've been kind of the spokesperson for getting Robolectric tests, or just unit testing in general, for that app. And it's actually worked out really well. It's solved quite a few bugs, and it's prevented quite a few other ones. So.
What's the approach for introducing unit tests on an existing code base? Did you just say from point on every?
Yeah, so that's the thing. We have a huge code base, right? And not everything, our coverage isn't awesome yet. So what I do is you kind of have to be reactive to it. right? So if we see crashing bugs and criticism and someone has to fix them, I request that there's unit tests for that. If you are making modification that hits legacy code, we try to at that time also add a couple of unit tests for it, right? But it ends up being a process. You have to, because the code base is large enough that it's not a great idea. It is probably a good idea, but it's not really feasible for us to just sit down for like 3 months and just write tests for everything. So we just make sure that every commit has tests and that we're testing new stuff, not only the stuff that we written, but like some of the stuff that's integrating with the stuff that we have written, and slowly introducing it. I think it's the only sane way we can really handle it at this point.
So how is your like you have like modules and then you test them, or you have like one module like the application?
So we have, as far as modules are concerned, we have basically one module, but we do have other libraries that we've built. Like our authentication library is a separate library that we import, right? So that's its own project. It actually sits completely outside. It's really nice having moved to Gradle because it can import it as an AAR really easily, and it'll have its own unit tests and whatnot.
Okay, and they run fine with Robolectric.
Yes, pretty much every Android project.
Okay.
Some of the other legacy ones are ones that we may have like gotten through acquisitions, might not be, but the general stance right now is to integrate Robolectric and write it, especially for new projects, and integrate it with old projects when we can, or if we haven't. But yeah, they're all independently tested, and then then be tested with them.
Okay.
But yeah.
And then like do they actually combine into the main application also when you run like tests against for the main application?
So if you're running tests against the main application, it's going to compile it, which includes bringing in all of its dependencies, right? So they will be there. Sometimes we might mock them out, like we don't actually want to make an authentication call. You could mock it or something, but we expect that its interface is working correctly because they have their own setup.
Not really.
Yes, I have a question. So, what tools do you use for the black box testing?
For black box testing?
Yeah.
So that's pretty much what the QA ends up doing, right? So that's mostly a UI testing sort of thing that we're doing, right? So they get a set of requirements. They don't know what the code really looks like. They just get a set of requirements on what it's supposed to do, and then they'll write automation tests using Appium or Selenium to verify that it meets those behaviors. But we don't have a team of like people going in and doing black box testing against like on a module or code level. Might not be a bad idea, but we don't have that.
You guys use a Robotium?
Do we use what?
Robotium?
No, but I want to look into it because I really don't like Appium. So, okay, I don't like aspects of Appium. I like the idea, and I like where it's going. I think in 6 months maybe it'll be really good. But right now it has some problems with XPath, and I kind of want to look at. We're going to be doing some look at our code base and some redesigns coming up in the next couple of months. So I want to be able to take the time to investigate that because it looks promising for our testing, I think.
Do you use Espresso?
Do we? Vivek? I don't think so. No. I'm getting a no. I'm getting a I don't think so. I haven't seen all of the code. I mean, it's a fairly large code base, so I'm not a complete expert. I've seen most of it.
Did you consider any alternatives like just using Mockito and running tests on JVM?
Well, so this is what allows us to do that, right? There's no real other way of running Mockito and stuff on the JVM because we're accessing Android code, right? So the Android jar itself, if you were to call any method, right? So if you're extending an activity and you want to call super whatever, which you're going to do, they're all going to throw runtime exceptions stub because the jars that are provided by Android as part of the SDK have no implementation. So really what Robolectric does, and I've actually done some development on Robolectric, it's kind of neat. You can see it. So Robolectric so here's shadow activity, right? So this is the activity that actually gets called. The way that they end up doing it is they're saying, they have a nice annotation for implementing activity. Really cool thing is you can actually create your own shadows for anything that's in the Android SDK. I'm kind of pushing them to allow you to make shadows of anything because you can't make shadows of your own code and there's places where that would be really cool. But you can make it for the Android code. And so what it does is it actually keeps track of a real object of activity. this code is pulled in with Robolectric from a Maven repository where they basically downloaded the entire Android code and compiled it so it has real implementation, made modifications so it would actually work off of a device. And then now we have an actual real activity, which is cool. So it'll actually call the real Android code and all those methods. But it'll do certain things where certain methods, like say this get application, it will change the implementation with this annotations. This is all done in class loader, and it'll return whatever they want to internally. This ends up being really useful for when you want to get information that you wouldn't otherwise be able to get, and that's stuff like the get last started activity, right? So if you even look at what was it called? Oh, it's not. Sorry, it's not in shadow activity. It's in like contest wrapper, I think, or something. I don't remember what it was, but basically, yeah.
Can you clarify what a shadow
Yeah. So a shadow is since we're not using. It's basically a re-implementation of the actual Android class that has been injected with a class loader. The reason why you can, so by default when you're using something like an activity, underlying it'll be using a shadow class to mimic the calls that you would normally be doing on an activity, because we don't have a real device, right? So if I want to say get my resources, it's going to have some sort of thing to figure out how to get those resources from the JVM. Even for things like if I say I want to make a component invisible or set it to gone, it doesn't have a device to actually do that, but it does want to keep track of it, right? So it'll have maps and that sort of thing to keep track of it. For any of the shadow classes, you can generally get a shadow version of it by just calling. There's a static method on the Robolectric class itself called shadow of, and then you pass it in, whatever object you have. Like if I have an activity, I can pass it in and get shadow of activity, and it'll return the shadow activity, which is this class. And the useful thing about the shadow activities is they'll expose additional methods that the base activity didn't have. So by default, this real object thing means that by default, if any method, it can override any method on it by using implementation. If it doesn't override it, it'll just use the real version instead. But for the ones that it does override, it might keep additional information. So like here's an example. This get default key mode thing, that's not actually in activity.class, but it might be something useful for testing, right? So the shadow class will let you access those things that are useful for testing that are hidden, that are normally kept by Android itself.
I'm using Android Studio. Do you think it's better just to use IntelliJ?
Yes, as a short answer. So Android Studio is really just a fork of the Community Edition that they've kind of tried to add in Android stuff, but they've also kind of removed a bunch of useful things. The fun thing is Google, since they're using Community Edition, which is open source, you're actually committing back to JetBrains. JetBrains gets all that stuff and then they reabsorb it back into Community Edition. So, and the Ultimate Edition. So if you have the Ultimate Edition, that's what I use. If not, use the Community Edition. You could use the Android Studio. I haven't found a reason to, really. It might be slightly behind as far as the Gradle, because they'll make it and they'll push it, and then JetBrains will get it, and then they'll incorporate it and they'll push it. But I've seen they've been pretty up to date. They've been pretty recent. Like I don't see much lag.
I think that trick that you did with reordering the dependencies doesn't work in Android Studio.
Android Studio is missing a bunch of those options. Like I don't even think you get it to see a dependency list in Android Studio. I know the other thing that I used to do until we got it, so that it used to be when we imported it, this directory was never marked as source. They've added that into the library. It didn't matter for us since we weren't running in here. But if you want to get like all of your quick I hit Control Space or whatever and I bring up stuff, it's really useful. In IntelliJ Community Edition and in this, you can just say mark directory as a test source. Awesome. For some odd reason, they removed that in the Android Studio, and I don't know why. It would have been really useful. I think it's because they really want it to sync with the Gradle file, and they want you making customizations. They expect that the Gradle file is the source of truth, and you shouldn't be able to make any changes to it. But sometimes you really want to. So I would just say go with the Community Edition, honestly.
Do you guys do any device testing?
On physical devices, we do a lot of physical device, so we don't do it in automations. We'll do physical device testing often like as we're developing because we want to see that. We'll do a lot of bug bashes where it's like, okay, everybody get out your phones because we all have a bunch of different phones, try out stuff, go through test plans. I think some of the QA will actually do physical device testing on different devices going through test cases. I don't know if any of those are automated. I know there's a service that I don't know if we use. I thought we used for a little while that actually has physical devices, and they would launch things onto physical devices and then press them for you with like a Selenium sort of thing. I don't know if we do. Do we do that anymore? We used to, I thought, or we looked into it. No, probably a good idea, right? Because we've definitely run into bugs where like, oh, this happens on an HTC One for some reason, but doesn't happen on other things. And okay, who's got an HTC One? Okay, now let's give that to a developer and figure out what the hell's going on. So it's a good idea, but we don't have like a formal setup for it right now.
Do you use any tools to measure like code coverage?
No, we should. The IntelliJ actually has a built-in code coverage, and I was thinking about adding Emma into it, but I haven't had time to add it in, and the tools team's been really busy, so we haven't had it in. It would be a good idea. I know our code coverage is probably really bad right now because we've got 800 tests, but it's even 800 tests is only hitting a small section of the application, so it would be good. But right now it's just like we're just adding tests as much as possible. I'm not super worried about coverage at this point. Coverage is just a metric. I think it can give people false senses of security on that anyway. I'm less interested about coverage and more interested in about testing plausible boundaries, testing definitely if you have a crash or something that obviously went wrong, when you fix it, have a test that would reproduce it. I've actually gotten some of our devs into trouble because they'll have a patch, right, and they'll have an RB, and I'll have a test, and that'll be great. So I'll download their patch, I'll apply it, I'll undo all of their changes and run their test, and if their test passes, I don't let them go through because they wrote a test that didn't do anything. The idea is when you made your fix and you wrote a test, the test should fail if the fix isn't applied, right? So gotten some people getting like, dope, off of that. Those are the sort of things I'm looking for, is that, yeah, every time we commit, if we're making a change, if we're making a fix, I want to have a test that if that change wasn't there, it would have failed.
Are you funneling all the code reviews through you?
No, there's a lot of people. But this is our we have kind of like a handbook sort of thing on the practices.
Yeah.
So for Android, generally when we do the code reviews, it'll go out to all Android developers who are on the review list, which is quite a few of us. And then you can specify each one. So you get the option of looking through all of them. And then there's a small, no, it's not really small. There's probably like 10 or 12 or something like that of us who have the permission to actually say, yes, you can give a ship it and it means something. Because if you try to push something and you haven't gotten approval from an RB, it'll reject it. It won't let it go through.
RB?
Review board, right? So we use review board. So if you have a review board up for reviewing your code, someone actually has to look at it and they have to give you a ship it on it. If they don't, when you do a git push, the Git system will reject it, saying that you don't have a proper review. And there's a list of people who can give those. Right, so it's spread out. It's not just everyone, but we try to get the reviews done within definitely within the same day. Usually within a couple hours. Usually it's someone coming over to someone's desk being like, "Hey, look at this with me," and then we go over it, to make sure that at least 2 sets of eyes have looked over a piece of code, any piece of code that's going in.
You said you do tests on real data. Are you doing it like automatically, or you do it manually?
So the QA will do full integration tests on production data using test users, right? So there'll be a test account that's on prod, and they'll make changes on that. The nice thing about, so that's automated, it's done on an emulator. The nice thing about that is it can catch both client errors and server errors, right? If the server starts sending weirdness, we can often file server bugs if there's a regression, right? Or if like a service is down or something, it can sometimes find those sort of things. So they are used. The developers, since we have we still have a backlog of things that we need to write for regression. Some of those are written by developers now. Like I've been working on them recently, but historically it's been QA. But it'll probably become more developer anyway because we just know the code a little bit better.
When you do tests on production, do you use the same account? You do like
Oh, there's-
reset for account? Or you
It depends on the test. We often have a new account was created, right? So usually, like I know with ours, a set of tests would have like, oh, this set of tests uses this user, right? And then the idea is ideally that user data shouldn't be changing so that the test will be, the same. My issue with doing it on a production server is if someone starts editing a user heavily, then your tests are going to go out the window because the data won't match what you expect. So, and that can always be be an issue. So each test generally will be under a different user, and if you do tests that modify data, those can sometimes get wonky because if I like change something and it fails, or if I change something and then I try to change it back and the change back failed, future runs might not work, and so that's always a fun issue.
But those aren't really unit tests.
No, these are integration tests. Those are regression, UI, and integration tests with the server. Right? These are making sure that yes, our app actually works against real data on a real server. No, unit tests are completely separate. These unit tests, if you ran a unit test and you ran it again, it should, and it passes the first time, it should pass the second time. If not, something is definitely wrong. Okay.
Thanks, Colin. So I'm gonna raffle off 2 Amazon gift cards. So if anyone didn't sign up on the mailing list, this is what